Hey there. Tonight we're diving into why it sucked to be a sailor on the USS Maine. The truth is, it was the grind. Pre-dawn hollystonning, sweltering fear rooms, cold-choked coaling days, and hammocks slung beneath heavy guns that really wore them down. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now make yourself cozy, maybe adjust your room temperature, or get that cup of tea, and let's explore tonight's tale together. You climb aboard, thinking you just joined the US, Navy's ticket to glory, but the smell hits you before the ideals do. Coal, warm iron, hot oil, damp rope. It crawls into your nose and refuses to leave. The ship's name reads like destiny across the stern, USS Maine, but the first lesson slaps you fast. Destiny smells like a boiler room and tastes like coal dust. You chuckle at the posters back home, promising adventure. The reality is binary. Either nothing happens for days, or everything happens at once, and everything tends to be violent. It is 1895 when Maine finally commissions. A hulking, late-to-the-party iron beast with 4 big 10-inch guns, 6 chunky 6 inches, and so much optimism bolted to nickel-steel armor that every rivet hums the word progress. Except the progress bit turns out to be relative. On paper, she displaces about 600 tons, measures roughly 324 feet bow to stern, and squeezes all that muscle into a hull that's powerful enough to scare a coastal fort and awkward enough to terrify the crew that has to live inside it. This is the cutting edge of the late 1880s. Design world, finally delivered years late. Already delivered years late, already wobbling near obsolescence. You find your bunk, except it's a hammock strung on the berth deck, under pipes, next to shells, near bulkheads that sweat in humid weather like a nervous salesman. Space is a luxury other people enjoy. You share the air with 300 plus other men, which feels like 3,000 when the ship is closed up for action drills. Maine carries roughly 300. And Maine carries roughly 355 officers and men when she steams into Havana Harbor in January 1898. Your entire world is a metal maze, painted gray, polished to a navy shine, and vibrating with the grunt of 2 triple expansion engines that together squeeze out somewhere near 9,000 horsepower on a good day. Speed tops out around 16 knots if all the coal behaves and the sea gods feel generous. In human terms, that's fast enough to make you sweat over the ash hoists and slow enough to feel ancient a year after you commission. You work in a floating furnace, fueled by coal. Coaling the ship is a full-body workout, invented by the devil. Coal dust coats your skin in 5 minutes and sticks like guilt. The ship takes hundreds of tons, upwards of 600 to 800, if you really pack the bunkers. Every lump carried by hand, shovel or bag. You end the day with coal in your hair, in your mouth, in your soul. There is no fitness trend that prepares you for this. You blow black mud out of your nose for 3 days and joke that the look is sootcore because you are a 19th century influencer nobody asked for. The Maine's layout tries to please everyone and ends up pleasing no one. Those 2 main turrets, each with 2 10-inch 30 caliber guns, sit not fore and aft in a straight line, but offset an echelon, one a little to the port side, near the bow, the other a little to starboard, near the stern. In theory, that lets both fire on either beam. In practice it means arcs of fire are a tangle. Blast damage is a real possibility, and the captain needs geometry skills and a stomach for risk. The 10-inch shells weigh roughly 510 pounds each and ride in a steel carousel of doom right above the magazines. Black powder, or its brown powder cousin used in those days, is stacked in silk bags in the bowels of the ship behind armored doors that your chief swears are safe as churches, which is another way of saying you do not sleep near them if you can help it. You eventually discover that nobody asked what the heat would be like. The engineers worship at the church of Scotch boilers. These horizontal return tube monsters burn coal, and the number you care about is not horsepower, it's the thermometer. The boiler room feels like 120 degrees Fahrenheit on a bad day, which is many days. The stokehold is the heart of it. You shovel coal into the fire, rake clinker, and dump ash while wearing clothes that feel like they are dissolving into you. The engine room is another sauna, a theatre of brass gauges and thundering rods where valves hiss so loud your ears ring, even in your hammock. Ear protection is a future invention. You step off watch, soaked in sweat, and when fresh water is rationed, your bath is a bucket if you are lucky and a wet rag if you are not. General upkeep on a ship like this turns into a personality test. Holstone the deck at sunrise. Polish the bright work until it blinds passing gulls. Drill at the guns. Drill at fire stations. Drill at collision stations. Drill for a surprise inspection, because the Navy runs on two things: coffee and fear. Life becomes a loop. Wake to a bugle. Chow down on whatever the galley wrestled into being. Polish, drill, curse, sling your hammock, and try not to think about the magazine a bulkhead away. The food is honest and weird. Salt beef and hardtack are still on the menu. Maybe coffee punches harder than a chief boatswain's mate. Beans and rice appear in heroic quantities. Fresh produce is a tourist that drops by only when the supply chain smiles. You find worms in the hardtack sometimes and declare this extra protein. You are lying to yourself, but it gets you through the week. Pay takes the edge off unless you look at it head on. An able seaman pulls something in the $20-something per month range in the 1890s. Specialty ratings pay more. Chiefs a lot more. But if your job title includes coal, heat, or lifting anything heavy, your lungs and shoulders subsidize the federal budget. The Navy abolished flogging decades ago, so that's good news in the long game of progress. The brig still exists, bread and water still exists, and the master-at-arms still has a smile that tells you he lifts for fun. The mail arrives when it wants, and the world shrinks to the length of the deck. You hang your hammock among men with names you learn too fast and too well, and men whose names arrive as nicknames because that's how a crew knits together. The Marine detachment stands out with their uniforms and habit of not smiling. They mess separately. They patrol the ship like polite wolves, enforcing order, standing post, and visiting the gun turrets with an air of casual menace that somehow makes you feel safe. You try learning to love the guns because gunnery practice gets you to the weather deck. The 6 inches hit your chest with each firing cycle. The 6-pounder quickfires snap and snarl like little dragons, and the 10 inches remind you that human beings harnessed fire and destructive chemistry, and then made it a job. Black powder leaves a choking cloud and a sticky residue that grips your hands and your uniform. Recall systems groan and return. Breech doors swing, and your fingertips smell like cordite's dirtier cousin. You train and train, punching rounds downrange at towed targets that look too small at 2,000 yards, and you develop a new respect for anyone who can hit anything at the ranges people brag about in newspapers. Battle is a math problem with wind, hull roll, and human breathing messing up all the variables. Your captain is Charles Dwight Sixby, and he is everything the uniform promises. Naval beard, naval caution, naval telegraph phrasing. He pushes the Maine through peacetime patrols and show the flag tours, and into the political theatre, and into the political theatre of the moment. Cuba is seething. Rebels have been fighting Spanish colonial rule since 1895. Americans read newspapers printed by men who discovered outrage cells. William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer push front pages that make your mother think Spain personally insulted the family cat. Everything in the Caribbean feels like a fuse. You steam into Havana Harbor on January 25th, 1898. The Maine eases past Morro Castle at the entrance, flags flying. You anchor in the middle of a city on edge, your guns pointed mostly at the water, because diplomacy says you do not swing steel at a neighbor if you are calling it a friendly visit. There is a Spanish cruiser in the harbor, the kind with a name that sounds like a king, and crews on both ships try to look neutral and professional while pretending not to stare. You are there to show presence, to protect U.S. citizens and interests, to soothe or pressure or simply wait. The heat in Havana wraps around you like a damp coat you cannot take off. White, tropical uniforms appear, and you thank the supply gods. Liberty gets granted in small doses with strict rules, because when politics run this hot, a shore fight turns into an international incident. The crew rotates watches, stands guard, swabs, drills, and tries to ignore gossip. Spanish officers visit politely. Cuban civilians stare. American newspaper men sniff for stories. The ship's band plays on the quarterdeck, because even iron warships need music to pretend they are human. You sleep where you always have, slung under steel, your head filling with the low hum of pumps and the higher whir of rumor. Some of the Maine's coal bunkers sit up against the forward magazines. Everyone knows bunkers can get hot, and bituminous coal, especially certain grades, can self-heat and even catch fire if stacked badly and left alone. Coal bunker fires are a grimly normal hazard in the era. You fight them by spreading, trimming, shoveling, watering carefully, and checking temperatures. Unknown to you on a winter Havana night, the line between hazard and catastrophe can be a hair's breadth if multiple things go wrong. At 9:40 p.m. on February 15th, 1898, Havana's map changes and your life ends or divides sharply into before and after. You feel the ship jump. A massive, hammering explosion booms upward under the forward part of the Maine. A second, smaller explosion follows, probably the forward magazine. The keel snaps or bends. Whatever word a court prefers later, your body recognizes a catastrophe. The bow seems to lift out of the harbor, and a jagged fountain of water and steel erupts where you kept your boots and secrets. The deck under your hammock tilts as if the ship is rearing like a horse. The forward third of the ship disintegrates. Men asleep in the forward crew spaces never make it out. The fore turret vanishes into a sheet of steam, flame, and darkness. If you are aft, you are lucky. You get ripped from your hammock. Your ears ring like church bells, and your nose fills with smoke so oily it feels viscous. The lights die. The ship plunges into silence. Then screams of steam leaks, metal grinding, and men calling out because they have not figured out how bad it is yet. Water pours through ruptures. The smell shifts to burned paint, hot iron, and that specific bite of high-explosive powder you trained with, but never inhaled like this. If you are near the engine rooms, the shock knocks you against pipes. If you are topside, you see the bow broken and vanishing, and a forest of twisted plates jutting up where the foredeck once stood. Rescue never moves like a drill. It moves like instincts you hoped you had. Boats dash from nearby ships. The American merchant steamer City of Washington sends help immediately, and Spanish boats arrive fast too, because even enemies in potential wars still believe in pulling men from the water. You float among debris, slicked with oil and bits of wood that used to be the wardroom table. Some sailors are scalded, some are bleeding from shrapnel, some move with that stunned, heavy motion of people who have not yet located their minds after the blast. Private William Anthony of the Marine Detachment delivers a message to Captain Sigsbee in the seconds that feel eternal, reporting the ship's condition with the formality Marines inhale with their first breath. Sigsbee composes a telegram that becomes part of the country's nervous system overnight. The Maine blown up in Havana Harbor at 9:40 p.m. and destroyed, many wounded, and doubtless more killed. Public opinion should be suspended until further report. He writes as the aft section settles, stubbornly afloat for now. The forward section already gone to a place divers will come to call black and sharp and unholy. The death toll is something you hear, counted in stunned whispers, and then shouted headlines. About 260 men die that night. The final tally of the dead later rises to 266. Out of roughly 355 aboard, the survivors include men aft or already on topside watch, and they carry burns, fractures, and a blank gaze that never goes fully away. The wounded go to Havana hospitals, Spanish and American, and some get better, while others leave their names to ships' lists and granite memory. The investigation begins before dawn, in a way because the press gets there first. Yellow journalism finds a perfect storm. Hearst's New York Journal and Pulitzer's New York World print sketches of underwater mines and villainous Spaniards, because subtlety does not sell 1 million papers. The country roars the phrase that becomes a war slogan: "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." The missing piece is certainty. But certainty is optional in a newspaper war. Every sailor who lived through the blast gets turned into a symbol, either the noble victim or the casus belli, when most of you were just trying to sleep on a hot night. Officially, the U.S. Naval Court of Inquiry in March 1898 studies testimonies from survivors, from divers, from officers, and from anyone who might anchor a chain of evidence. The board's conclusion states that an external explosion, something like a mine, detonated under the forward magazines. It stops short of assigning blame. Meanwhile, a Spanish inquiry runs its own test and says the opposite, an internal explosion. In other words, your wreck becomes a courtroom as much as a grave. Once the war starts in April 1898, the Maine turns definitively into a rallying cry, more than a technical challenge. The country surges into the Spanish-American War, a short, chaotic sprint across the Caribbean and the Pacific. Dewey takes Manila Bay. U.S. troops fight at San Juan Hill. The war ends in months. Treaties get signed, and the U.S. unwittingly graduates into empire. In all the victory, the Maine remains unsettled, a ghost with a question attached to its name. If you are a survivor, you get parades and sorrow, and a lifetime of hearing the word mine thrown around like it explains grief. It is 1911 when the government returns to the wreck to try again. The Army Corps of Engineers builds a cofferdam around the Maine in Havana Harbor, pumps the water out, and raises what is left. Engineers and divers crawl over the twisted steel. The forward third is still a geometry lesson in violence. The Vreeland Board, named for Rear Admiral Charles E. Vreeland, reviews the new evidence. It still leans to an external explosion and still uses the word likely, which is science's infuriating cousin, when what people want is a villain. If you are counting ghosts, bodies are recovered from the hulk and reinterred. The ship's remains get towed out, and scuttled in March 1912 with honors, flags, and a last great splash into deep water. In 1976, Admiral Hyman G. Rickover, father of the nuclear navy, commissions a study because old mysteries bug engineers. His team uses drawings, photographs, survivor accounts, and logic that sweats the details. Their conclusion edges toward an internal cause, likely a coal bunker fire, adjacent to a magazine that overheated and set off the forward magazines. He publishes How the Battleship Maine Was Destroyed, which reads like a detective novel with footnotes. He is not trying to clear Spain's name so much as to crush sloppy thinking. He points out that coal bunker fires were not rare, that the Maine's design put heat and powder in a questionable embrace, and that in a world without perfect evidence, internal cause fits the facts cleanly. In 1999, National Geographic funds a forensic re-examination using 3D modeling through a firm called Advanced Marine Enterprises. It also leans toward an internal explosion scenario, the kind that starts slow and ends instantly because chemistry does not do half measures in a magazine. The conclusion is not unanimous across all experts, but the weight of modern analysis pushes toward not a mine. The 1898 court's external explosion holds first in memory because it came first and served a political moment. Later reconstructions remind you that memory and metallurgy disagree more often than not. This whole debate is why it really sucked to be a sailor on the Maine, even before the blast changed everything. You slept next to a design compromise. Coal bunkers rubbing up against powder magazines is a bad roommate situation. Coal in certain grades can slowly oxidize and heat up over time. Temperatures in bunkers can climb silently. Brown and black powder do not like heat. Magazine ventilation existed, but late 19th century ventilation was like whistling at a house fire. If the right bunker smoldered and the wrong door stayed open or the wrong bit of insulation failed, the ship you trusted could betray you in your sleep. This was not unique to Maine. It was one of a dozen compromises in many warships of that era. That does not mean it felt fair when fate picked your hull. If you had lived long and healthy aboard, daily life still ate at you. Hygiene was a polite suggestion. Below decks smelled like a stew of leather, sweat, oil, and paint. Heads, navvy talk for toilets, were forward and simple, and the line at dawn never once failed to remind you about shipboard democracy. Fresh water was rationed because distilling took fuel and time. The Navy's messing system in the 1890s required each little mess to send a man to the galley for food in heavy pots, which then had to be lugged back through narrow passages, while a boatswain's mate found a new and exciting reason to yell. You ate elbow to elbow at mess tables that vanished into the overhead as soon as chow ended, replaced by the next drill, like a scene change in a play that would not let you leave the theater. The weather doubled down on the misery. In Cuba's winter, it felt like summer to anyone not from the tropics. The humidity climbed into numbers that made your uniform stick to you like a promise. Cockroaches had union strength. Rats worked nights and slept like they paid rent. The air below felt old and dense when the hatches were closed, for real or practice. You slept fitful and woke up damp. The white uniform blazed under sunlight and turned grey fast under coal dust. Sickness stalked the peerless air just because every nation's microbiology loved ports. Yellow fever haunted cities like Havana because Maine anchored offshore and controlled school of ventilation levels matters. You had a better shot than the infantry in jungle camps later that summer, but the fear stayed real. Gunnery mishaps nipped at the edges of every practice. A misfire meant you had to open a breach that wanted to open a breach, that wanted to open with all the heat and heart of hell itself. A hangfire, a delayed ignition, lulled you with quiet that ended in a bang when someone's face was too near the chamber. The crew learned the ritual of patience and tongs. You get told all the safety rules, and you break none of them, and your hands still shake when something bangs wrong. Turrets could jam, rammers could misalign. Training stops came down like stubborn gatekeepers. You heard stories from other ships about breach explosions, powder bags scorching, and a man who never again light fireworks. Your turret crew builds a rhythm to prevent joining that list. Coal was not just dirt and heat. It became time stolen from your life. Coaling ships meant 2 days of loading, trimming, cleaning, and coughing. It got everywhere. The deck afterward looked like a grotto of black glass. The crew looked like miners. You swabbed and scrubbed and rinsed until the ship looked less like a chimney and more like a warship again. Sailors joked the ship ran on black diamonds and bad decisions. Jokes are the Navy's favorite armor. Discipline felt like a civilization built on friction. The rocks and shoals, the articles for the government of the Navy, hovered in the air, a printed sheet of sins and punishments. Miss a watch and wake up with your name in a petty officer's memory for the next 6 months. Disobey a lawful order and taste confinement that felt like a closet with iron bars and less dignity. Desertion did not end lives physically, but it did spiritually. Promotions arrived slowly, and only if you never breathed wrong in front of the wrong person. You were your evaluations, and somebody else wrote them. Add the existential meteor that is international politics. In the late 1890s, the Navy is a revamped institution, modernizing hard after a post-Civil War slump. Ships like Maine and her near-sister class were built in the late 1880s, but launched into a world changing at the speed of steel mills. By the time you commissioned, European navies had refined turret arrangement, secondary batteries, and fire control in ways that made Maine's weird in echelon turrets look like a design school project graded on a curve. You lived with that knowledge as rumor and then as fact. You served on a symbol of national pride, already breaking the speed limit toward being a museum piece. Except museums tend not to blow up at anchor. If you want the clean mechanics of why sleeping on Maine could turn into a nightmare, the list starts in the unseen. Powder magazines sat behind armored bulkheads, which stayed safe if nobody pointed a fire at them. The coal bunkers next door gave off heat, sometimes a lot of it. Coals can spontaneously combust when piled in confined spaces, especially if the coal is of a type with a lot of volatile matter. Chemically, it oxidizes slowly and heats. If the heat cannot escape, temperature rises. If the temperature rises enough, the coal begins to smolder. If smoldering meets wood, lagging, or other structure, or air in the wrong place, real flames happen. In Maine, the layout put one of those forward coal bunkers hard up against a magazine. If that bunker got hot, and if the magazine's temperature rose enough, beyond the roughly safe zone, you had the grim possibility of powder igniting. The menace is silent, and the timeline can be slow until it is not. This is not a hypothetical scare tactic. Coal bunker fires were so common that watch bills included special instructions, and some ships carried dedicated thermometers. The British Royal Navy and the US Navy both wrote circulars on how to spot and fight them. The early 20th century has incidents of coal bunker blazes caught in time on other ships. Maine's story is a worst-case scenario, welded to a politics bomb. That is the frustration survivors feel for the rest of their lives. If you are supposed to be a warship, Your first job is not to detonate yourself at anchor. You also swallow the special bitterness of watching your friends' names become hashtags in 19th century style. The slogan, "Remember, the Maine," becomes a drumbeat for war. It galvanizes the nation. It also simplifies you. You are the righteous victim of a foreign mine in a harbor run by a colonial empire. That story fits rally speeches and sells bonds. It does not mention that your ship likely carried its doom in the normal machinery of its design. It does not mention that your captain's first telegram begged for the luxury of waiting for evidence. It does not mention that the dead were men who slept on hammocks near Powder, because that is where the Navy told them to sleep. Your ghost learns the rest of the timeline. In 1901, remains from the original burials in Havana's Colón Cemetery get brought to Arlington National Cemetery. The main mast memorial goes up in 1913, using the ship's foremast as a monument. Names get carved in granite, and headstones line up in rows, clean enough to break your heart. The memorial becomes a place where people say, "Thank you to a ship that launched a war, and to sailors who never had a say in how their story would be rewritten." When the government raised the wreck in 1911, more remains were recovered and interred with honor. The hull went to sea one last time in 1912 and slid into deep water with flags, words, and the strange serenity of a destroyed ship being allowed a grace note. If you imagine you could have enjoyed the Maine in a purely naval way, you still hit weird design quirks that make even a gunnery nerd sigh. Those 10-inch guns with their 30 caliber barrels were short by later standards. Their maximum range looks respectable on paper, but at battle distances of the era they fired slower and less accurately than later quick-firing guns. Their rate of fire was slow because bagged charges and human effort do not operate like machines. The 6-inch guns of 30 calibers offered decent punch, but the Navy was already discovering that rate of fire, and shell weight needed a new balance that would not settle until after 1900. You served right before the great gunnery reformers, people like Captain Percy Scott in Britain, and later William Sims in the US, pushed navies to improve fire control, spotting, and training drastically. In other words, your training felt substantial until the world changed out from under it. Daily drudgery refused to get out of the way. Bright work consumed half a life. Paint consumed the other half. You lived by turn to and secure course, with bugles telling your ears when to become arms and legs. Boats were lowered and hoisted in patterns that felt like choreography, until the night the city of Washington's boats arrived at speed and made a harsh ballet into a rescue. Lines were coiled, then uncoiled for the 50th time, because orderly lines equal safety. You polished brass every day on a ship destined to re-enter nature as rust and legend. Liberty in Havana should have been the reward. The band played. The city thrummed. Cuban independence fighters and Spanish loyalists eyed each other in cafes. Every conversation with a local could spiral into a politics lecture. Rum tasted like a small god, and you were not allowed to drink much of it for reasons that got explained with phrases like good order and discipline. Chronicles talk about street scenes, about cigar workers reading newspapers out loud in factories, about families watching the Maine sit in the harbor like an iron omen. You saw the city in snapshots and returned to the ship, smelling like sea breeze and tobacco smoke and the same coal that stained your hands. The sleeping arrangements fit their own special chapter in the book, called Why It Sucked. Hammocks packed tight when you have bodies to store. The beam of 57 feet sounds roomy until you fill it with bulkheads, guns, storage bins, ventilation trunks, and 100 pieces of equipment that sailors forget exist until they stub a toe on them. Breech blocks are heavy, rammers are heavier, and you learn to walk hunched and careful in rough weather. And you did sail through rough weather sometimes. The motion turned hammocks into pendulums. Hammocks are comfortable if you like being a cuckoo. They are pure nightmare if you have to get out fast when the ship explodes. On February 15th, 1898, a disturbing number of men died because they were asleep in exactly the places the blast ripped apart. You try not to grow bitter about the way memory works. For decades, school books say, mine. They name Spain without hedging. The Maine becomes martyr-proof of a clean war for Cuban freedom. Later, the textbooks update to say maybe not. The Navy commissions studies and memorial services, and historians write with varying levels of certainty. And the average person still mostly hears the slogan. If you are telling this as a sailor, you correct details. You say the ship was not a first-class battleship, but an armored cruiser labeled second-class battleship in the Navy's evolving taxonomy. You list the exact date, February 15th, 1898. You name Captain Sigsbee. You say 260 men died instantly, or soon after the blast. Later, the final dead reached 266. You point to the U.S. Naval Court of Inquiry in 1898 and the Vreeland Board in 1911-12. You nod to Admiral Rickover's 1976 analysis that said internal origins were more probable. You add that National Geographic's 1999 3D modeling also lean that way. You talk like a person who did not get the courtesy of a singular truth. You also take a moment to commend the Spanish harbor workers and sailors who pulled men out of the water. That fact has the slippery habit of falling out of patriotic narratives. Spanish authorities in Havana respected the dead, assisted the living, and maintained dignity in a crisis that could have become a riot. The city of Washington's crew did the same. Charity is one of the practical arts sailors carry between nations, because the sea does not do politics when it puts a man in the water. There are hazards this story hardly has time for, because they exist in a sea of hazards. Fire control in 1898 is a set of optics, not a network. Voice pipes carry orders. Lights blink out when you need them most. Pumps that keep water out of the ship work heroically until a blast somewhere else breaks a pipe or collapses a compartment. Compartmentalization helps until the force tears through many at once. The Maine went down so fast forward that the word compartment felt like a joke. You still remember the strange calm of the stern settling and how it let the aft section survive on the surface long enough for men to escape. Industrial engineering and blind luck combining to give a few sailors a spare life. Sailors have a private catechism built from rules and superstitions. Do not whistle on the bridge, because it might call the wind. Keep the galley clean, because rats become legend if they get cocky. Respect the sea, because it kills quietly. Do not trust a ship that feels warm in the wrong places. Check the vents, check the hatches, check the powder room, because powder is your friend until it is not. The Maine's mess printed all those lines into the crew's memory in the worst way. A ship, even a flawed one, is your universe, and trusting it is survival. When trust shatters, it rewrites everything you thought you knew about steel, command, and promises made by recruiters. By the time the last reef drops into the water, over the Maine's final grave in March 1912, the United States has moved on to bigger ships and bigger ideas. The Navy launches monsters like SS, Pennsylvania, and eventually all big gun dreadnoughts that make Maine look quaint. The design lessons filter forward. Ammunition magazines get better separated from heat sources. Ventilation becomes more science than hope. Turret arrangements simplify and grow. Fire control matures into rangefinders, central spotting, then electronics. The ghosts look down and say, "So that is what we were for." They smile a little when somebody still stops by the mainmast memorial in Arlington and wonders about the men who swung in hammocks and joked through coal dust and never got to be old. You lived and served in an era that was mid-sentence. Maine was an in-between, warship from an in-between navy, born in an in-between moment, when America learned how to be a world power by accident. The accident came with names and faces. Your best friend from your first coaling day, the petty officer who taught you how not to die in a turret, the Marine who said almost nothing and saved 2 men in the blast because he moved like a machine when it mattered, the engineer who never stopped smelling like oil, the cook who made beans that kept 100 men fed enough to keep working, the bugler who somehow hit every note. If the question is why it sucked to be a sailor on the USS Maine, the answer is not just one line about a mine. It is a litany. You worked on a ship where the design mashed coal and powder into neighbors and called it normal. You stood watches in heat that punished lungs and soaked uniforms daily. You shoveled coal by hand and ate it with every breath. You stayed clean by willpower when water rationing said otherwise. You trained on weapons that filled the air with smoke and risked misfires as part of the package deal. You slept in hammocks strung near steel walls that could turn into shrapnel. You did all that inside a city where diplomacy and revolution pressed close, while newspapers in New York wrote your fate in block letters. When the ship exploded, people used your death to make a war declaration sound like a funeral eulogy and a marching song all at once. When experts returned later with rulers, 3D models, and a man named Rickover, they said the enemy might have been your own coal. That meant you and your friends died from a banal hazard dressed up by bad luck and physics. There is no glamour in that, only a warning and a lesson. The warning lands more than a century later, because it is not just about rivets and bunkers. It is about how stories get told. Remember, the Maine turned into a national refrain, while the reality lived in the cracks. A late 1880s design, delivered in the mid-1890s, design delivered in the mid-1890s. A tropical harbor in 1898. Coal answering a question nobody meant to ask. The Vreeland board in 1911, 12, and Rickover in 1976, and National Geographic in 1999 stand as footnotes to a headline that never shrank back to fit the evidence. You want details that bring you back to the deck because abstract misery gets boring. So you tell it like this. Your back aches from lifting an ammunition crate, labeled with numbers that make sense only to a gun captain. Your shirt sticks. The petty officer in charge of the magazine checks temperatures with a thermometer that looks like a science class prop and logs them in a book as if the book can hold back physics. He orders a shift in coal in bunker A or B or whatever letter the plan says sits beside the powder. You grab a shovel without thinking about it. Slag burns. Slag burns on your forearm from yesterday's ash tube, and you forgot to complain. You look forward along the deck and see the foremast and the flag with its 45 stars and the yellow lights from Havana reflecting off black water. In another life, you could say it is beautiful. On this ship, in this century, it is a picture taken an instant before things go sideways. You lived by numbers too. Maine's top speed on trials, somewhere around 16.3 knots. 10-inch shells at 510 pounds. 6-inch shells roughly 100 pounds. Total crew around 350 to 360. Casualties on the night of February 15th, 1898. About 260 dead immediately, or by next day, final number, 266. Your pay as an able seaman in the neighborhood of $24 a month. Hull length, 324 feet. Beam, 57 feet. Nicked armor thickness, marketed as modern. Turret armor in the 10-inch range. Belt armor, thicker, near the waterline. 2 main engines. 8 or so Scotch boilers depending on counting method. 4 torpedo tubes installed, because fashion said torpedo tubes were modern, even if use in 1898 ranged from theoretical to theatrical. Numbers spackle memory. They turn pain into a ledger. They keep historians honest and ghosts calm. You absorb the cultural weather, too. Late 19th century America looks outward with a mix of swagger and anxiety. Industrial power grows like a weed. The frontier myth moves from prairie to ocean without catching its breath. Politicians talk about sea power and our place among the nations. Alfred Thayer Mahan writes the influence of sea power upon history in 1890 in language so hypnotic to policymakers that appropriations follow, like disciples. You get ships because Congress learns that money spent on steel and docks buys prestige. You get war because policy built on adrenaline and cartoons about Spanish cruelty finally finds an ignition point. You get to be the ignition point because your ship blew up at anchor on a warm night within sight of Havana's street lamps. Even the rescue scene irritates you because of how noble it was. The city of Washington's crew rose like madmen. Spanish sailors reach out bare-handed. Men who might have fought one another months later grab wrists, haul bodies into boats, and lay jackets across burned skin. This is the version of humanity you prefer. It is the world flexing decency under pressure. It is the part of the story that deserves a slogan. The newspapers do not choose that slogan. Newspapers in crisis years rarely do. The ship afterwards sits like a mangled question mark under murky water. Divers go down and feel with their hands, because silt and darkness turn eyes into passengers. They report plates curled outward or inward. They describe paint burned off, as if wiped by a giant rag. They count rivets removed by force and bulkheads torn like paper. They return with stories about bottles in the wardroom turned to teeth, and a piano turned to driftwood. Their words become transcripts. Later boards of inquiry read those transcripts and argue about what outward or inward really means when you talk about plates that bowed before they broke. You become a veteran in record time if you survive. The service moves you to another ship. You meet a crew that looks at you the way sailors look at people who know fire up close. You never again sleep so deeply that you do not wake at the sound of a hiss that sounds like steam. You develop a superstition about boilers that you keep to yourself because nobody wants to hear from a prophet of doom at 3 a.m. You read someday that Hyman Rickover, the man who fathered nuclear submarines with the zeal of a reformer, took the time to relitigate your ship's last 4 seconds, and you think, good. Someone else was angry about this for a living. You read later that National Geographic did a high-tech model and thought it was internal. You smile because modeling is beautiful, and the wreck is gone to deep water, and the wreck is gone to deep water, and the dead are in Arlington. And what you always wanted was for someone to turn down the noise and read the plans. There is a handful of myths you enjoy, smashing even if you do it gently. Maine was not a perfect ship built in perfect time. She was a product of a new navy, mid-transformation, commissioned in 1895 from a design dating to the late 1880s. Her turrets were not placed conventionally. They were offset and created tactical compromises. Her powder was not smokeless glitter. It was older chemistry prone to making the air thick and the lungs heavy. Her crew were not all native-born Americans. The U.S. Navy has always been a polyglot institution. and immigrant sailors staffed the force in meaningful numbers in the 1890s. The cause of her destruction was not settled in 1898. It is a technical debate with credible modern evidence, pointing inward more than outward. The phrase remember the Maine helped light a war, but it did not explain it. You treasure the details that cut through noise. Captain Sigsbee's first telegram told the Navy and the country the ship blew up at 9:40 p.m. and asked the public to suspend judgment. The U.S. Naval Court of Inquiry in 1898 concluded an external explosion likely set off the forward magazines and avoided assigning blame to any party. Spain's board concluded it was an internal explosion. The Vreeland board in 1911-12, after raising the hull within a cofferdam, leaned again toward an external cause. Rickover's 1976 study, based on original plans and a systematic review, said an internal coal bunker fire was more probable. National Geographic's 1990-99 3D reconstruction supported the internal explosion hypothesis. No new physical evidence has appeared since then to overturn the weight of modern interpretation, and many naval historians today view an internal coal bunker fire leading to a magazine explosion as the most plausible chain. That is not courtroom certainty. It is the closest thing history offers. If you stand on a pier and draw a straight line from Maine to today, you get a chain of cause and effect that looks like an engineer's dream and a poet's outline. In the aftermath, navies refine magazine insulation, improve bunker design, add temperature monitoring as a religion, and shift tactics as guns, powder, and propulsion evolve. The U.S. Navy grows from a coastal defense force to a global fleet. Pearl Harbor later teaches a different hard lesson about ships at anchor. Rickover's nuclear fleet solves the coal problem by replacing it with a radioactive problem handled with evangelical discipline. The line ends at ships that still carry human beings who sleep near things that can ruin everything in seconds. You are back in your hammock on the night you want to pretend did not happen. You can count bugle calls earlier, like a lullaby. Tattoo, then taps. You can feel the hull's shallow roll and hear water slapping plates in a rhythm you have learned to find comfort in. Men talk in low voices about a letter from home or the way the band played The Girl I Left Behind Me that afternoon. Somebody laughs without moving too much because every hammock laughs with him when he twists. Somewhere forward, a watchman checks his lantern and looks down into black water reflecting Havana's lights. Somebody aft scribbles in a journal about nothing and everything, because that is what journals are for. Then the world tears in half. You exist in that before and after line permanently. Everything you have to say afterward is a footnote to an explosion. You find humility in the everyday courage it took to live aboard Maine, long before and right up to the night of the disaster. It is courage measured in shovelfuls of coal and minutes in a boiler room, rather than in medals. It is a fire drill run well in sweat and shouting, a gunnery exercise executed with care, a petty officer double-checking the magazine doors, a watchstander noticing the faint smell of smoke and calling it out. It is private acts of gumption by men whose names slip away faster than headlines. It is unglamorous courage that kept ships on the right side of the line, called safe. You talk now in the second person, because the only way to make this real is to put the listener in your hammock and in your boots. You say you slept in heat that filled your lungs with salt and smoke, that you called until your hands bled black, that you ate hardtack with worms who signed leases on your rations, and you joked about the extra protein because jokes were free. You say you learned the science of powder without reading a textbook. You say you lived by clocks and bells, and orders barked through voice pipes and megaphones. You say you watched a harbor city forgive you and hate you and use you, depending on the day and the newspaper. You say you felt your ship become a slogan, and then a study, and you prefer being a study because at least the study respects the complexity. You end with a truth that is not complicated. Being a sailor on the USS Maine meant living under a mountain of steel and expectation with a coal shovel in one hand and a gunnery sponge in the other. It meant trust. Trust in rivets, in pipe fittings, in powder bags, in procedures, in officers, in shipmates. That trust is the gap between boredom and catastrophe. On February 15th, 1898, trust broke. The crew paid the price. The world learned something it kept and something it forgot. You want it to keep the lesson about design, vigilance, and the way mundane risks collect until they feel like fate. You want it to forget the lazy certainty of slogans. You want people to understand that your life and your death belong to an era that built heroes out of ordinary men and machines that could betray them without warning. You climbed aboard for adventure. You got history instead, not the storybook kind with neat villains and clean causes. The messier version where steel expands when it is hot, coal breathes when it is piled high. Men love their friends and newspapers love a fight. It sucked to be a sailor on the USS Maine because fatigue, heat, and design conspired against you daily. And because the one night you needed your ship to be perfect, it was human instead. And yet, you did the job. You stood your watch. You coaled your ship. You trained your gun. You slung your hammock. You became a line in a fleet's lineage, a name on a memorial, a lesson in every naval engineering class, and an echo in a slogan the country still remembers while it slowly learns the harder truth behind it. Next, let's turn our attention to the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, Suleiman's reign. Coffee and croissants did not come from the Ottoman siege of Vienna. And no, a lone hero did not sneak past Janissaries with a sack of beans. That viral myth runs on caffeine and wishful thinking. The real story is far bigger, grounded in siege trenches, cannon trails, imperial paperwork, and a sultan whose empire stretched from Budapest to Basra. During the reign of Suleiman I, known in Europe as the Magnificent, and in Ottoman chronicles as Kanuni, the lawgiver, the empire reached a scale that made Habsburg sweat. Venetians pivot their business models, and the Safavids dread the next campaign season. The world in the 1520s did not revolve around Suleiman alone, but it often felt like it. He took the throne in 1520, at age 25, inheriting the turbocharged momentum of his father, Selim I, the same Selim who crushed the Mamluks in 1516 to Bin. 1517 rolled into Damascus, Cairo, and the Hijaz, and yanked control of the holy cities and the Red Sea trade routes into Ottoman hands. By the time Suleiman unfolded the imperial map, Constantinople's old Byzantine palimpsest had been rewritten with Ottoman ink. He was not about to sign off with a polite period. The world he stepped into had some heavy hitters. On one side, Habsburg Charles V stacked titles like a medieval LinkedIn. King of Spain, Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of Burgundy, lord of half the New World's silver. On another, Francis I of France wanted to outshine. Charles the France wanted to outshine Charles V, and was perfectly willing to cut deals with the Sultan to do it. To the east, the Safavid Empire under Shah Ismail, and later Shah Ismail, and later Shah Tahmasp ran on charismatic Shia devotion and brilliant cavalry, plus a habit of being exactly where Ottoman logistics least wanted them. And floating around the Mediterranean, Andrea Doria carried the reputation of a sea wolf, who preferred strong winds and careful hedging. Suleiman's first moves were not coy. In 1521, he took Belgrade, a fortress so vital that Mehmed Dest had failed against it in 1456. The fall of Belgrade cracked open the Danube gateway like a stubborn vault. Chroniclers noted the method. Ottoman artillery and sapping teams carved through the masonry with a patient brutality that turned walls into mathematics. When historians like Halil İnalca and Caroline Finkel describe Ottoman expansion, they point out the same through line. Siegecraft plus administration plus calibrated terror, applied like a well-run business that happened to wear turbans and carry muskets. Then 1522, Rhodes, the island bastion of the Knights Hospitaller, had been a pirate thorn in Ottoman ribs for decades. Suleiman arrived with a siege train and an attitude. After a harrowing campaign and relentless mining beneath the walls, the Knights negotiated honorable withdrawal in December. The Sultan escorted them out, letting them live to fight another day in Malta. That decision looked magnanimous and theatrical, very on brand, but it also stripped the Aegean of a strategic enemy port without turning it into a permanent ruin. The Ottoman style was often ruthless. It was also frequently pragmatic. Next came 1526, the showdown on the Hungarian plain. The Battle of Mohacs landed like a cosmic anvil. On August 29th, the Ottomans met the army of King Louis II of Hungary near the marshy fields by the Danube. The Hungarian nobility favored heavy cavalry charges that had worked in an earlier age. Ottoman firepower, artillery, and matchlock musketeers shredded those charges and turned the battlefield into a mass grave. Louis II died fleeing the disaster, thrown from his horse into a flooded ravine. Contemporary estimates run high and messy, but even conservative numbers echo a calamity. Around 20,000 to 25,000 Hungarian casualties in a single afternoon. It was a kingdom-ending moment. Ask any historian of Central Europe. Gabor Agostin, Paul Fodor, or Jeza Palfi, and the answer comes back the same. Mohacs broke medieval Hungary. That collapse produced a succession crisis that should get more airtime than it does. One camp backed János Szapolai, voivode of Transylvania, which meant leaning on Ottoman support. Another rallied behind Ferdinand of Habsburg, the brother of Charles V, which meant Habsburg claims and Habsburg garrisons. The Ottoman solution was simple. In 1529, Suleiman rolled north. He installed Szapolai as his vassal in Buda, flexed amphibious logistics the size of a small city, and arrived at the walls of Vienna on September 27th with a grand army measured in tens of thousands. There is no single agreement on numbers. Some early sources throw out 120,000. Modern scholarship usually lands somewhere below that. But the force stood large enough to erase any Habsburg sense of invulnerability. Vienna did not fall. Late autumn rain turned the Danube corridor into a mud proving ground. Gunpowder misbehaved. Supply lines strained. Ottoman miners tried to tunnel under the bastions, and defenders countermined with the energy of men who knew what failure meant. On October 14th, with food short and snow threatening, Suleiman called it off. It was a measured retreat, not a panic flight, but the myth that Vienna was some grand Ottoman turning point refuses to die. There was no immediate collapse, no civilizational pivot. The Ottomans were back in the region again and again, turning Hungary into a chessboard of fortresses and reward timars, and turning Habsburg night sleep shallow. This is the part the dressing room mirror of European memory often leaves out. The failure at Vienna did not put Suleiman on the back foot. In 1532, another campaign forced Ferdinand to his knees with a treaty in Constantinople that conceded Habsburg inferiority in rank, and confirmed Ottoman suzerainty over much of Hungary. The population in central Hungary started dealing with Ottoman fiscal registers, the deferters, where scribes recorded plots of land with bureaucratic obsession. Ottoman Empire building was warfare plus spreadsheets. He needed the spreadsheets because he knew exactly what he was building. Not only a conquest machine, a state. The empire's population at mid-century hovered somewhere between 15 and 25 million, depending on where historians draw the imperial boundary in their calculations and how they count pastoralists and provincial households. Istanbul's population alone swelled to roughly 400,000 to 500,000 by the 1550s, a size rivaling or surpassing any European capital. With markets that smelled like spice, leather, copper, fried dough, and anxiously negotiated Venetian contracts. What held it together was law. Suleiman's nickname, the lawgiver, was not a prize stunt. Working with the jurist Ebu Suud Effendi, he standardized land tenure, taxes, and penalties across regions where previous rulers had scribbled exceptions until chaos peeked through. The Ottoman legal synthesis, Sharia plus canon, religious law plus sultanic decree, was neither a free-for-all nor a modern constitution. It cut deals with reality. In the countryside, peasant usufruct rights on state land, miri, were protected within a system designed to keep soldiers mounted, and the treasury paid. This is where the Timur cavalry, Sipahis, entered the story. A Sipahi got land revenue in exchange for turning up on campaign, mounted and ready, with armed retainers proportional to the land's income. The numbers in any year fluctuated, but the Timur system could pull tens of thousands of horsemen into the field. 40,000, 50,000, even more during massive campaigns, without draining the central cash box to nothing. Salaries for the standing infantry did drain that box, and that is where the Janissaries, Kapakul, stood like a loaded line item. In Suleiman's early years, the Janissaries numbered in the low tens of thousands. Modern scholars place them around 8,000 to 12,000 in the 1520s, growing toward 15,000, 16,000 by mid-century. Their daily wages and bonuses mattered to imperial stability. The Janissaries were not just palace guards. They were the empire's core musketeers, trained for siege lines and street control, known for chanting loudly when pay lagged. The treasury ran on akis, small silver coins, and while exact annual revenue totals in akis make even hardened historians sigh, serious estimates land in the hundreds of millions of akaj. By mid-century, equivalent to several million Venetian ducats. Haller Nalchik and Surai Faroki point to budgets that ballooned and contracted with campaigns. Either way, this was a fiscal state that knew how many horses, mules, gunners, and sacks of flour it could afford, and it wrote it all down in script that looked like calligraphy doing push-ups. Behind that military administrative core stood faces the textbooks used to ignore. Ibrahim Pasha of Parga, the Grand Vizier, elevated from a Greek Christian background through the Devashirme and palace training. Rustam Pasha, a Croat by birth, a fiscal hawk who could squeeze a coin until the mint mark cried. And later Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, a Bosnian Devashirme product who would become the bureaucratic brain by the end of Suleiman's reign and continue into Selim II's. The empire's senior management roster read like the map of conquered populations. The court made it policy. Take boys from the Balkans, convert them, school them to within an inch of their lives, rank them by merit, and promote ruthlessly. The Austrian ambassador, Ogier Giselin de Busbecq, wrote back to Europe that Ottomans promoted by competence rather than birthright. He overstated the case. Patronage and palace networks mattered, and Hurrem Sultan's influence mattered a lot. But the comparison to ossified European aristocracies hit home. The myth that the Devshirme was a simple pipeline of enslaved child soldiers carved from Christian families misses the varying reality. It was compulsory in some regions and intermittent in others. Certain communities carved exemptions, and many families, over time, maneuvered to get sons into the system because the payoff, Timar grants, palace positions, top-tier connections, could be spectacular. Morally clean it was not. Effective it very much was. The empire made the Devshirme part of its machine, and that machine moved east as surely as it moved west. By 1534, Suleiman's army cut into Iraq. Tabriz, a Safavid showpiece, opened its gates more than once to him. First in 1534, and again in a later campaign, because the Safavid army did not love pitched battles against Ottoman heavy artillery. Baghdad fell in December 1534. The Ottomans took Mesopotamia and kept it. The long war of maneuver against Shah Tahmasp turned into a documentary about the logistics of not catching a phantom. Safavid cavalry avoided the Sultan's siege trains, raided the countryside, and left empty granaries behind them. Suleiman installed garrisons and built the administrative bridgework that stitched Ottoman Iraq into the empire. The Treaty of Amasya in 1555 finally turned a wandering front line into a line on the map. The Ottomans kept Baghdad and the Kurdish highlands under their suzerainty. The Safavids retained the Iranian plateau and their heartlands. The Sunni-Shia divide hardened into borders that still echo today. In history, tragically, some lines do not fade. Diplomacy kept pace with the marching feet. In 1536, the French King Francis I, locked in a Habsburg death hug, secured capitulations with Suleiman that gave French merchants sweeping privileges in Ottoman ports. Jean de la Forêt, the French ambassador, worked out terms that led even calm Venetian merchants to get heartburn. The so-called Franco-Ottoman alliance did not require the two sides to hold hands in church. It required both to ruin Charles V's plans. The arrangement gave French goods low customs rates, allowed French flags to shield trade under Ottoman skies, and did something else just as important. It multiplied the intelligence networks each side could access. By the late 1530s, the Mediterranean had realigned economically and militarily, and a lot of it had the Sultan's Tura stamped somewhere faint in the background. At sea, the empire's expansion looked different, but felt just as relentless. Hayreddin Barbarossa, once a corsair, now the Capudan Pasha, brought the Ottoman fleet to maturity. He took Tunis in 1534, got chased out by Charles V in 1535, but then clawed back the balance of power with raids and alliances that made Spanish coastal villages sleep, jumpy. In 1538, off the coast of Preveza, he faced Andrea Doria's so-called Holy League fleet. Raw numbers are slippery, but the basics are clear. Doria fielded something like 300 ships, many of them sailing vessels with guns that did not play well in close Mediterranean melees. Barbarossa brought around 120 galleys and galleots, oar-powered war machines that loved calm seas and tight formation work. The wind faltered, Doria hesitated, and Barbarossa punched a hole in the league. Ottoman naval supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean settled in for decades. Roger Crowley, chronicler of Mediterranean wars, likes to note that after Preveza, Christian fleets needed home court advantage and careful planning to risk an open fight. By 1540, Venice had signed a humiliating peace, paid a 300,000 ducat indemnity, and ceded key ports in the Peloponnese, Nauplian and Monemvasia, to the Sultan. On land, the Habsburg front did not slow. In 1501, on Furchik, John Zapolya died. The Habsburgs moved on Buda, to claim their slice. Suleiman did not write letters. He marched. Buda fell into Ottoman hands through a mixture of stratagem and force, and the eyalet of Budin was born. Central Hungary turned into a directly administered province. The empire of Suleiman now touched the Habsburg frontier along a jagged line of castles and rivers that would bleed men and silver for a century and a half. Fortresses like Esztergom, Székesfehérvár, Pécs, and Pest entered Ottoman gazetteers. Others, Eger most famously in 1552, held out with ferocious defense. The siege of Eger became a Hungarian epic. István Dobor and Gergely Bornemisza improvised an explosive resistant identity for the town. The Ottomans, who took to Mesvar the same year, left Eger for another time. They got it in 1596, decades later, under different leadership and different tactics. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Red Sea and Indian Ocean gambits rarely get the love of the Danube campaigns. But the Sultan watched Portuguese fleets choke spice routes and dispatched his own admirals to pry open those commercial nostrils. In 1538, the Ottoman admiral Hadim Suleiman Pasha sailed to the Indian Ocean, captured Aden, menaced Diu in Gujarat, and reminded the Portuguese that cannon talk in multiple languages. He did not break the Estado Dar. He did not break the Estado Dar. No one could do that with a single campaign. Piri Reis, the mapmaker sailor, whose charts blended Arabic, Portuguese, and classical learning, led another expedition in the early 1550s, grabbed Muscat in 1552, and tried to snatch Hormuz from the Portuguese throat. Hormuz held, enemies of humidity exhaled, and Piri Reis lost his head, later in Cairo, after a messy withdrawal. Yemen, taken and retaken and retaken across the century, became a graveyard for easy plans. Basra, though submitted peacefully in 1546, giving the Ottomans the Shatt al-Arab and another choke point on the Gulf. North Africa snapped into the imperial fold with a pattern equal parts gun point and franchise model. Algiers recognized Ottoman suzerainty. By the late 1520s, Barbarossa and his successors, like Turgut Reis, Dragut, ran pashaliks that acted with wide autonomy as long as they acknowledged the Sultan and kept hitting Habsburg coastlines like metronomes. Try telling Charles V's accountants the distinction between autonomy and aggression. In 1541, Charles mounted a massive expedition to retake Algiers. The storm annihilated much of his fleet, and the remainder got worked over by Algerian guns and musketeers. Turgut Reis captured Tripoli from the Knights of St. Time. John, in 1551, cementing Ottoman presence in Libya. By 1560, the Ottomans crushed a Spanish-led armada at Djerba, an island battle that left a lacquer of sun-baked horror and a tower of skulls the victors were in no rush to hide. By 1565, when the Ottomans besieged Malta, those same knights now defiant on a new rock, they ran into one of those freakish defences that become legend. Turgut himself died from a head wound. The siege, commanded by Lala Mustafa Pasha and P.I. Pasha, failed after months of ferocious attacks. Malta survived. Ottoman naval power did not vanish. The Mediterranean would not forget Djerba. Back at court, the theatre of power ran hot. Ibrahim Pasha, the Grand Vizier who had marched beside Suleiman from Belgrade to Baghdad, was executed in March 1536 in the Topkapi Palace. Historians argue over why. He pushed too hard on titles, collected enemies, and strayed into theological controversy. Harem Sultan's influence did not help his case. In the selective silence of imperial chronicles, the record tilts toward fate rather than gossip. What matters is the structural truth. No vizier was safe if he looked irreplaceable. Hürrem Sultana, Roxolana in European texts, was not a footnote in court politics. She entered as a slave concubine from the Ukrainian steppe, charmed, strategized, and married Suleiman around 1534 in a break with sultanic tradition. She bore sons, Mehmed, Selim, Bayezid, Cihangir, and latched onto a political machine that reached through palace corridors to provincial appointments. Her charitable foundations changed the urban fabric. The Haseki Hurrem complex in Istanbul, with its mosque, soup kitchen, and hospital-fed bodies and reputations. She wrote letters to Polish kings and negotiated with ambassadors with merciless courtesy. The so-called Sultanate of Women did not begin in a single moment, but Hürrem dragged that influence into daylight. The cliché that this era was all conquest misses the visual proof. Standing on Istanbul's third hill, the Suleymaniye Mosque, designed by Mimar Sinan and built between 1550 and 57, raised a perfect geometry over the Golden Horn. Sinan, a military engineer turned architect, had already tested his lines on the Sezade Mosque, completed in 1548. In the Suleymaniye, he laid out a campus, madrasas for legal training, a hospital, a caravanserai, a vast imari where thousands of bowls of stew slid across tables every day. The empire fed bodies to build loyalty and souls to build legitimacy. The mosque complex doubled as a billboard. The message read, "This empire governs." Up close, it governed with texture. The famed millet system that modern readers imagine as a formal set of autonomous religious communities did not exist as a neat code in Suleiman's time. There was plenty of pragmatic tolerance for Orthodox Christians, Armenians and Jews, Himmi status, jizya taxes, and protection in return for loyalty and money. But equally, plenty of bureaucracy and opportunism. Jews expelled from Spain in 1492 thrived in Ottoman cities like Salonika and Istanbul. They printed books, Hebrew presses in Istanbul date from 1493 under Bayezid II and continued under Suleiman. And doctors, translators, and doctors. Armenians ran networks in trade and crafts. Greek Orthodox hierarchs navigated a complex politics of survival around the patriarchate. The state bargained with communities, tolerated as long as order and tax flows went unblocked, and cracked down when revolts flared. On coinage, there is a correction. The armchair economists miss. The Akech held steady early in his reign, with minor debasements, a chronic feature of 16th century governments. The real shock came later, outside Suleiman's lifetime, with a flood of New World silver that knocked medieval price structures sideways. Still, the tremors were building. Venetian ducats shone in Ottoman pay chests. Spanish real seeped through Mediterranean markets, and sultans learned the hard way that cash paid soldiers faster than in-kind land grants. The Timar system stayed robust under Suleiman, but the long mark bent toward paid infantry and bigger fleets that did not swing swords for tax receipts. If this sounds like a modern state struggling with budgets and social contracts, that is because it was 16th century style. The Divan Nu Humanu, the imperial council, met regularly at Topkapi, where grand viziers and scribes worked in rooms laid with Iznik tiles while the sultan watched from behind a gilded grille. He did not attend every meeting in person. He did not need to. He had a system, and men like Salalzad, Mustafa, recorded its decrees with glorious penmanship. When scholars talk about the Ottoman classical age, this is what they mean. Institutions that made conquest possible and peace survivable. The myth that the Ottoman army steamrolled with brute force, flies apart on inspection. Artillery trains required roads, bridges, pontoon gear, animal fodder, and forward depots. Hungarian winter mud did not care about imperial titles. In 1529, the Vienna siege artillery bobbed because logistics could not beat climate. Ottoman siege engineers, Hungarian carpenters in pay, and Balkan muleteers formed a screaming machine that ran on barley and discipline. No logistics, no empire. Gabor Augustin's work on Ottoman gunpowder proves it with numbers. Powder stores, cannon barrel manufacturing, munitions, depots at strategic points from Belgrade to Edir. The empire converted gunpowder from mystery to worksheet. Out on the Danube, the frontier ramped up into what historians call the Habsburg military frontier. The Ottomans answered with a chain of pashaliks and sanjaks, Budin, Temeshvar, Iyeri later, and a patchwork of client princes in Transylvania, Wallachia, and Moldavia. Transylvania and the John Sigismund, Zapolia, and later princes operated as an Ottoman vassal monarchy. Wallachia and Moldavia toggled between disobedience and tributary status. In 1538, Suleiman marched into Moldavia and asserted authority over the fortress of Bender, Tihina. The fortress would matter. The fortress would matter later in wars with Poland and Russia, but the point then was clear. No independent pocket next to the steppe would be allowed to go fully Habsburg. The Crimean Khanate, a Tatar state under the Giray dynasty, had been an Ottoman vassal since the late 15th century. Under Suleiman, the Khans raided Poland, Lithuania, Muscovy, and the steppe with grim efficiency. The raids moved humans as currency. The Black Sea slave trade sent captives to Ottoman ports. That ugly part of the economy stayed in the shadows of court poetry, but paid for kit and horses. In the 1550s, Muscovy under Ivan took Kazan, 1552, and Astrakhan, 1556, pushing to the lower Volga. The Ottomans later tried to respond with a Don-Volga canal plan and an Astrakhan campaign in 1569 under Sokollu. That happened under Selim too, but the idea floated in late Suleiman years. Proof that even the mighty could not be everywhere at once. Inside the palace, tragedy cut deep. Prince Mehmed, the Sultan's talented son by Hurrem, died in 1543. Prince Siangir, long ill, died in 1553 during a campaign. That year, the empire witnessed a moment that produced centuries of whispers. Prince Mustafa, the popular and capable eldest son by Mahidevran, was executed in the camp near Konya on orders from Suleiman amid accusations of treason. Historians have no patience for easy explanations. Was Mustafa plotting? Did Harem and Rustem engineer his ruin? The documentary record is thin and partisan. What is certain is that fratricidal politics lived right under the skin of Ottoman succession. Princes governed provinces, built rival entourage, and when a father died, the race to the throne meant the loser usually did not keep his head. Suleiman chose Selim, the future Suleiman too, and sealed the choice with blood. The empire remained stable. The cost sat like lead. Suleiman aged, but he did not fade gently. In 1566, he rode for one last campaign, at age 72, toward Szigeti, Far, a fortress in southern Hungary, held by the Croatian-Hungarian nobleman Nikola Subic Zrinski. The siege was brutal. Zrinski staged sorties with a flair for doom. Ottoman artillery turned walls into memory. The summer heat did not flinch. On September 6th, as the siege neared its end, Suleiman died in his tent. His death was kept secret until the fortress fell, and only then did Sokollu Mehmed Pasha make it public. The legend that the Sultan's heart was buried at Sigitvar belongs in the category of stories that feel true because they are poetic. What matters is that his body returned to Istanbul. The campaign closed with victory, and Selim II took the throne without the kind of open civil war that tore other dynasties apart. Back in Istanbul, the Sultan's tomb rose near the Suleymaniye, carved with geometry that made even skeptical Europeans pause. The architect Sinan, by now the empire's Michelangelo, with fewer temper tantrums and better engineering notes, had built a skyline that argued for divine order and administrative competence. The Ottoman state had laws, budgets, armies, and style. It had janissaries who could read payroll ledgers and spy cavalry who could recite tax terms as easily as Quranic verse. It had poets, Suleiman himself, writing under the pen name Muhibi, left thousands of verses that mixed conquest bravado with longing and piety. The empire fed the poor at Imerez. Sponsored by sultanas and viziers, it patronized scholars who interpreted law to match land tenure realities. It funded fleets with oak and sweat and chained oars. Was this the empire's zenith? Many historians mark it so, with careful asterisks. Territorial control peaked, or nearly so, in this era. The legal codification, forged under Suleiman and Ebesud, established norms that would govern for centuries. The Ottoman-Habsburg rivalry settled into a long, grim embrace that would last until 1699. Trade boomed. The Franco-Ottoman alignment tilted European politics. But the seeds of future strain lay quietly at the edges. The ongoing militarization of the frontier would bleed resources. The slow shift from Timar-based cavalry to cash-paid infantry and fleets would pinch treasuries whenever silver runs thin or coinage credibility slipped. The Janissary Corps, still disciplined in Suleiman's time, would later bloat with privileges and marriages that transformed it into a political pressure group. None of that negates the scale of achievement. It grounds it. The empire's greatest age was a ladder braced on careful logistics, hard law, and terrifying campaigns. Myths crowd this era, so a little cleanup helps. The croissant story, created to celebrate Christian victory over the Turks by shaping pastry like the Ottoman crescent, belongs around the 1683 siege for Vienna at best. And even there it holds water like a sieve. The coffee house myth about Ottoman beans, found after 1529, likewise leans false. Coffee's road into Central Europe ran slower and not through a single lucky stash. The image of the Janissaries as a childhood kidnapping machine that ate souls every spring misses that the devashirme was an administrative practice that changed over time, operated unevenly, and often led to social mobility within the Ottoman order. The flattering tale that Ottomans practiced uniquely modern tolerance also misses the coercion and hierarchies baked into dhimmi status. They tolerated plenty and crushed hard when needed. The empire gets no medal for being nicer than its neighbors when the baseline was early modern violence. On the battlefield, the tropes need adjustment. Vienna 1529 does not prove Ottoman weakness. It proves the limits of 16th century logistics. Preveza 1538 does not erase Andrea Doria's skill. It showcases Barbarossa's superior platform for that day's conditions. Malta 1565 does not signal the end of Ottoman sea power. It demonstrates the unpredictable brutality of coastal siege warfare and the effect of a few narrow causeways and manic defenders. The Polish-Lithuanian-Ottoman frontier in Moldavia and the steppe did not present a simple story of raiding. It showed how fragile lightly governed frontiers always are. A state can be magnificent and messy at once. The empire's administrative core deserves more attention than most highlight reels give it. The tax registers the Tarid Deftele, are the soul of early modern Ottoman governance. Teams of scribes visited towns and villages, recorded who owned what and who owed whom. They assessed sire from non-Muslim male, adults, harvest predictions, and names of cultivators. This was not laissez-faire empire. It was a unit that loved a good ledger. The numbers became cavalry, grain, bridges, and coin. When Suleiman turned Hungary into an eyalet, he did not rest after putting a flag on a castle. He sent scribes. He sent judges. He set coin weights. He demanded roads that could carry cannons in spring. He also pushed culture. The Suleimaniye was not his only architectural billboard. He built in Damascus, Jerusalem, Mecca, and Medina. Aqueducts fed Istanbul's thirst with stone arteries. Caravanserais popped up along imperial roads like sturdy motels that knew how to handle camels. Hypnotic, Esnik tiles took over walls, glowing turquoise and cobalt like someone weaponized geometry. Crime and punishment did not get lost in the pattern. Thieves lost hands. Rebels lost heads. Firman scrolls ordered public works, then public lashes, then pay to widows. The empire kept receipts for brutality and benevolence on the same shelf. European eyes watched. Venetian Bailey, embedded in Istanbul, sent home meticulous reports about grain prices, Janissary mood, and the tone of the Grand Vizier's sarcasm. Habsburg ambassadors measured the size of the fleet being built at the imperial arsenal, the Tersain Ayamaya, on the Golden Horn, where the constant clang of hammers hit the ears like a civic metronome. Busbek, who served as ambassador in the 1550s, shipped tulip bulbs home, setting off a horticultural chain reaction that would climax in a Dutch mania long after Suleiman's death. Tulips and janissaries in the same dispatches. It made the empire feel like a paradox factory. It was not. It was a system that could be gentle in buying grain from Bulgarian peasants on Monday and savage in besieging a Hungarian castle on Friday. On the religious side, the Sultan kept tight with orthodoxy. Ebu Suud Effendi's legal opinions helped align state land law with Islamic jurisprudence, an interpretive gymnastics move that let the Sultan collect taxes without looking like a usurper of sacred property. The Sultan's claim to the caliphal mantle, inherited in ideological form from Selim's conquest of the Mamluk domains, stiffened Sunni legitimacy. Against the Safavids, the empire did not pretend. Anti-Shia policies in eastern Anatolia remained harsh. Suspected Kizilbash faced persecution. The Sunni-Shia divide lay not only in books, but also in burnt villages and terrified survivors. The modern world inherited that fracture like a live wire. The other fracture, dynastic succession, grew sharper with every son. After Mustafa's execution, the Sultan's sons narrowed to Selim and Bayezid. Bayezid rebelled in 1559, fled to the Safavid court, and learned that being a pawn means getting knocked from the board by people smiling. He was captured and executed in 1561 under a deal that underscored how political expedience runs religion's stop signs. Selim became heir. He was not a wander. He drank wine, wrote poetry when the mood struck, and delegated happily. Historians nicknamed him the Blonde, and later judged him against a father who could ride all day and negotiate all night. The empire he inherited was powerful enough to handle a sultan who did not relish the saddle. Institutions stopped being optional, and this brings the story back to expansion under Suleiman. Between 1520 and 1566, the empire expanded its land borders by absorbing central Hungary, reasserted itself in the Arab world by locking down Mesopotamia, dominated the eastern Mediterranean, by beating back Venice and the Holy League, established high seas projection into the Indian Ocean, even without beating Portugal outright, and coaxed vassalage and tribute from rulers who learned that the Sultan's patience was measured in cannon barrels. Numbers helped the point land. Belgrade 1521, Rhodes 1522, Mohawks 52,026, Vienna 1529, Baghdad 1534, Preveza 15,058, Buddha 1541, Esdagon 4, 54-3, Temesvar 1552, Jerba 1560, Malta 1565, Saigetavar, Pejai Far. These are not random pins. They sketch the outer skin of an imperial body at its most muscular. Meanwhile, inside the skin, recruitment pipelines ran hot. The palace schools trained pages in languages, mathematics, calligraphy, and war. Marriages tied the ruling house to powerful households. Rustem Pasha married Hurrem's daughter, Mirima, forming a family compact that controlled vast waqf endowments and gave orders legs. The Janissaries, still technically unmanned and bound to the barracks in this era, guarded their privileges with teeth. Their salaries rose when inflation or scarcity ate into real purchasing power. Their loyalty, bought with regular pay and victory, paid the state back with terrifying competence on narrow walls and muddy causeways. The empire's ideology hardened with success. Suleiman styled himself as Caesar of Rome, Caesar Irum, claiming the Byzantine heritage along with the caliphal mantle, a dual claim that made sense in a city that straddled continents and histories. Diplomats heard the message and adjusted honorifics carefully to avoid giving offense that got armies marching. The Ottoman Chancery crafted letters that balanced awe and menace with an artistry that deserved a gallery. Ceremonies in Topkapi embraced theatrical distance. The Sultan was the shadow behind the gold grill, a man whose face could be worshipped but not met. He was also a manager who checked the numbers. Seen this way, the empire's greatest conquests under Suleiman were not just geographic. They were administrative dominion, legal codification, and international diplomacy. The Franco-Ottoman alliance made papal statesmen grind their teeth, but the spreadsheets add up. Venetian traders cursed and then counted profits in Ottoman ports under French flags. The Safavids learned to survive by dodging rather than winning. The Habsburgs fought for a century and a half to turn Hungary into something livable again. In each arena, the Sultan's regime set terms that others had to adapt to. Modern readers often look for a single turning point where empires start to decline. It flatters a sense of narrative neatness. The Ottoman Empire under Suleiman refuses that convenience. The Great Siege of Malta did not end anything fundamentally. Vienna 1529 did not mark the beginning of the end. The Treaty of Amasya did not fix the East forever. The story looks more like a long series of sprints, each leaving behind structures that kept moving even when the sprinter stopped. When Selim II took over, those structures, the capitulations, the frontier garrisons, the naval arsenals, the legal codes, kept working. Later sultans would face new dynamics. More silver, more gunpowder, a less fractured Habsburg Spanish power. After the 1559 peace of Cato Cambrisis, a more organized Persian enemy. None of that erases the fact that under Suleiman, the empire's machinery hit a hum. The receipts historians love are everywhere. Venetian dispatches mention ship counts at the Tersain, including 150-plus galleys under preparation in some seasons. The Tahrir surveys in Boudin recorded hundreds of villages and tax rates pegged to productivity. Busbek's letters describe janissaries in simple uniforms, carrying matchlocks with silent pride, sitting cross-legged and listening to readings. Ottoman registers note the creation of the Boudin Eyalet in 1541 as if filing a legal update rather than recounting a conquest that turned kings into refugees. The French capitulations get copied and recopied, renegotiated to death by French consuls who discovered that privilege lost definitions when a pasha wanted a cut. The pomp of the Suleimaniye inscriptions praises God and the Sultan. The kitchen ledgers list onions. Step back a moment and look again at that opening myth. Croissants do not rise from the mill 520. Siege. Coffee houses in Vienna do not owe their lineage to a sack left behind by a panicked Ottoman retreat. But something very real did get baked into Europe during Suleiman's years. A recalibration of power and commerce that forced old kingdoms to modernize or choke. Habsburg armies learned to keep permanent garrisons, build magazines, and rely on professional soldiers in place of seasonal levies. Venice abandoned Atlantic pretensions and doubled down on Levantine trade under Ottoman terms. France reaped profits and headaches from trading under a Muslim sovereign's aegis. Elizabethan England watched warily and flirted with Ottoman commerce later, sending merchants east in hopes of catching some of that Mediterranean cash flow. The empire turned European fears into European reforms. It turned fears inward as well. The story's most intimate legacy is not the big battles, but the faces in the palace. Harems, philanthropy seeded neighborhoods, Mirima Sultan's mosques, commissioned from Sinan, framed the city's skyline. Rustem Pasha's mosque, near the Spice Bazaar, wrapped its walls in Iznik tiles, now treated like museum pieces because time accidentally monetized them. These were not ornaments. They were monuments with endowments attached, paying salaries for teachers, imams, soup kitchen managers, and lamplighters 400 years before modern welfare states. They fed legitimacy as much as bodies. When Suleiman died, the empire did not shudder. It took a breath and kept walking. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha continued grand projects, dreamed up canal plans, and ran the state with frightening competence. Selim II stayed off horses and trusted men who could say no to him politely. The frontier still bled, but it bled on Ottoman timelines. The Ottoman fleet still launched, and in 1571 it would meet disaster at Lepanto, a battle outside Suleiman's lifetime that gets overplayed in European memory because the image of shattered galleys suits a certain narrative. Even after Lepanto, the Ottomans rebuilt their fleet in a year and kept North Africa and the Aegean largely under control. That is the kind of detail that ruins easy stories and delights historians. Contemporary scholars have put chisel to myths with care. Alilenaltup tracked budgets and timars like a forensic accountant. Gabor Augustin pulled apart the myths of Ottoman military backwardness and demonstrated gunnery sophistication. Caroline Finkel stitched the many theatres into a comprehensible whole. Soraya Farokhi laid the social and economic structures bare. Roger Crowley followed oars and sails into the smoke of naval battles. Primary sources line up behind them. Ottoman Chronicles by Silal Zad, imperial registers gathering dust until leafed through by archivists, and European letters pouring through diplomatic pouches faster than censors could stamp them. The picture is rich, contradictory, and precise. What sets Suleiman's reign apart is the way it marries law and war, mosque and mint, canon, foundry, and poetry book. The famous Tura, his sultan's calligraphic signature, curves like a piece of kinetic art that implies speed and power. It is not just art, it is the brand of a political order that could move janissaries across the Balkans faster than a Habsburg band could draft a letter. It is the symbol of an age when the Ottoman Empire expanded not because a single man wanted glory, though he surely did, but because the state had discovered how to be a machine with a human face. Belgrade's broken walls, Rhodes's surrender, Mohacs's corpse-littered field, Vienna's muddy ramparts, Baghdad's citadel, Preveza's quiet sea, Buddha's newly hung banners, Ezet-Degum's cracked basilica, Temesvar's open gates, Jerba's foaming beach, Malta's stubborn cliffs, Sigidvard's smoking ruins. Each scene tells a part of the same story. An empire expanded, codified, argued with God and gold, fed and killed, built and taxed. The story leaves no room for Croissant legends, but it leaves plenty for awe at the scale and precision of what Suleiman's reign achieved. The empire could recline on carpets and recite poetry, but it could also cross rivers at dawn, with pontoon bridges laid in hours. It could feed tens of thousands of soldiers in the snow with mules and registers. It could glare at Venice until tariffs bent. It could endure the kind of palace tragedies that kill dynasties and still function at full load. The Ottomans of Suleiman's time were not invincible, but they were, by every metric that matters to 16th century statecraft, astonishingly competent. That is the punchline not enough people tell. Suleiman's empire expanded out of cannons, yes, and out of sermons, yes, but mostly out of ledgers kept so well that wars became administrative events. The Sultan sat beneath domes that defined the skyline, and he signed firman scrolls that defined lives. His expansion south toward Baghdad, west into Hungary, and afloat across the Mediterranean was not a series of heroic improvisations. It was a campaign plan that used poetry for legitimacy, scholars for legality, viziers for continuity, and gunpowder for punctuation. It left behind an order that later sultans exploited, abused, and sometimes misunderstood. It left behind cities that still breathe his name in the stone joints of mosques and bridges. It left behind borders that still trap arguments and hopes today. The coffeehouse myths can keep entertaining dinner parties, but the serious applause belongs to the way this reign wrapped law around ambition and made geography obey. That is the expansion of the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman. Not a fairy tale about pastries, but a hard, glittering saga of administrative genius and military reach, and the stubborn, smiling knowledge that behind the turquoise tiles and the cannon smoke stood a bureaucracy that knew everyone's business, right down to the last aksha. Our journey through history continues with why it sucked to be a Roman legionary. You sign your life over with an oath, and the empire owns your spine. No reset button, no transfer request to a quiet desk job in Rome. Just 20 to 25 years of marching, digging, sweating, bleeding, sweating, and hoping the pay shows up before your boots disintegrate. The recruitment pitch sells you Rome's greatest hits: aqueducts, victory parades, eagles gleaming in the sun. The fine print sells you cheap vinegar wine, trench foot, and a centurion's vine stick to the ribs if you blink at the wrong moment. That oath has a name: sacramentum. By uttering it, you promise obedience until discharge or death. The Republic wants: let citizens go home after a season. The Empire prefers you as a long-term asset. Under Augustus, the standard for legionaries settles around 20 years, then creeps up toward 25 under Tiberius. Auxiliaries, the non-citizen troops, sign up for 25 to win the precious diploma granting citizenship at the end. The Praetorian Guard down in Rome gets an easier gig, shorter service, bigger pay, and everyone in the legions knows it. This is the part where the brochure smudges. Recruitment does not always feel like volunteering. Sometimes a dignified levy slaps a spear in your hand, whether or not your farm needs you. Age varies. Some show up in their late teens. Others are older to fill quotas. Good teeth, strong back, no obvious deformities. Height requirements exist on paper. In practice, an empty roster gets creative. Disqualifications vanish. When barbarians cross rivers, training fixes your posture and ruins your joints. Vergius, the late Roman drill sergeant who wrote De Re Militari, brags about teaching recruits to run in armor, throw javelins, and hit a wooden post called a palace with a double-weight practice sword. He wants you doing 20 Roman miles in 5 hours as a normal march, and faster for a forced one. A Roman mile is about 1,480 meters, so that normal day clocks roughly 29.6 kilometers. On roads your grandkids will brag about building, that is survivable. Through German swamps or the hills of Judea, it is pain. The sword in training weighs more than the real one, so the real thing feels like lightning. The gladius you carry, for real, is not a giant iron club. It is usually a short, brutally practical blade, around 45 to 50 centimeters long, pointed for thrusting through ribs and under shields. Your javelin, the pilum, stretches a bit over 2 meters, with a long, slim, iron shank designed to bend on impact so the enemy cannot throw it back. That clever feature also turns your life into a metal retrieval nightmare after battles. Your spear sticks in shields, bodies, mud, everything except a convenient quiver. The famous armor is not uniform. Lurica hamata, chain mail, eats hours of your life oiling and mending and weighs somewhere in the 8 to 12 kilogram zone. Lurica segmentata, the articulated plate that Hollywood loves, sits around 8 to 10 kilograms and pinches at the shoulders like a bitter aunt. Helmets, iron or bronze, with cheek pieces and a handsome ridge, bring another couple kilos of headache. The scutum, a curved rectangular shield, about 1 meter tall, wooden core, with a leather skin, can push 8 to 10 kilograms. The shield boss dents beautifully when life gets loud. Marching light is a lie. You are Marius Mule, a nickname that dates to Gaius Marius' reforms in the late 2nd century BICE, because he made legionaries carry their world. The sarcina, your pack, is everything. Sling a forked carrying pole over your shoulder. Hang from it your cloak, your mess kit, your handmill to grind, grain, extra sandals, spare tunic, water flask, perhaps 2 sharpened stakes for the nightly fortification. The stakes matter more than sleep. Each night, you dig a ditch and throw up a rampart for a marching camp, because ancient nightmares have teeth. An average ditch 2 or 3 meters wide and about 1.5 meters deep. Rampart on the inside, sharpened stakes at the crest, gates at the crest, gates at the cardinal points. You and roughly 5,000 of your closest friends have this down to a choreography. Entrenching tools slam into dirt before your pulse slows from the march. The smell of fresh turned soil and sweat hangs over the site like a tarp. 8 of you live under a leather tent, the contubernum. 8 is theoretical. Tents rot, mules die, weather picks favorites. The tent itself, made of stitched animal hides, weighs around 20 to 25 kilograms when dry, which it never is in northern Britain. Some units have pack animals for tent gear. When they drop dead, you inherit their job. Boots, caligae, are heavy-soled open-work sandals with hobnails, fantastic for roads, terrible for frost and rain. Archaeologists at Vindolanda, on Hadrian's Wall, found letters from soldiers asking home for socks, sandals, and underpants. The word for socks The don'ts tells you everything. Your toes would like to resign. The daily ration is not a cooked meal, handed over with a smile. Grain is issued raw. You and your tent mates grind it with a hand mill, mix it into dough, and bake kind of bread or porridge on coals. A normal day puts somewhere around 0.8 to 1 kilogram of wheat in your belly when the supply wagons keep up. Meat shows up as salted pork or bacon. Cheese appears when the gods feel like it. Oil or lard goes into the pan. Everyone swears by Posca. The soldiers drink vinegar mixed with water and sometimes herbs. It hydrates and doesn't try to kill you the way bad water does. It also tastes like defeat warmed over, but it keeps your intestines from staging a rebellion. This diet is energy-dense, but not romantic. Occasionally, the unit punishes someone by swapping out wheat for barley. The barley ration is not a new flavor option. It is a public humiliation. Horderie is what they call the punished. You hear it in the tone. Pay exists on paper before it exists in your hand. Julius Caesar famously raised soldiers' pay to 225 denarii a year in the 40s by Augustus effectively set that as the rate. Domitian bumped it to 300 around 84 C. Septimius Severus juiced it, again roughly a century later, some sources putting it at 500 or more. Before throwing a party, register the deductions. Food, clothing, boot, nails, sometimes even a share of your gear, comes out before your denarii reach you. Papyrus pay lists from Egypt show long columns of stoppages. The concept is familiar to anyone who has stared at a payslip and wondered why air is a taxable benefit. Debunk the salt myth now. The word salary comes from salarium, and sal means salt, so legends claim you are paid in salt, like a walking ham. Ancient writers love rhetoric. Real pay is in coin. Sometimes salarium referred to a salt allowance in specific contexts, but the legion did not dump blocks of salt in your lap and call it even. You count denarii, not crystals. The myth sells a good story. The logisticians want receipts. Bonuses sweeten the bitterness. Emperors throw donatives, one-off payments, at troops during accessions or crises. The Praetorian Guard learns to negotiate these hard. In 41, Claudius becomes emperor after Caligula's assassination. And the guards help. Claudius pays, and everyone in the field forces notices. State-sanctioned bribery becomes a policy. Booty distribution after a big siege can be enormous. The sack of Jerusalem in 70 Seth floods Rome with gold and slaves. Josephus gapes at the temple treasures. Regular legionaries get a thin slice after the state, and the commanders take their thick ones. That windfall looks massive next to delayed basic pay. It vanishes in debts and prices that magically rise whenever troops are in town. Discipline is not a pep talk. The centurion carries a vine staff, the vitis, and it lands where it aims. Flogging is standard for sloppiness. Polybius, the Greek historian who loved Roman discipline more than some Romans did, lists punishments so severe modern readers blink. Sleep at your post, and the unit beats you to death with clubs. Steal from your comrades, and the same. Desertion deserves creativity. The army also punishes whole units for disgrace. Decimation is the famous one. Kill 1 in 10 by lot, while the rest look on. It is rare, but real. Crassus used it in 71 base against units that ran from Spartacus. Mark Antony reached for it in the Parthian nightmare. The idea is theatrical terror. The result is a whisper that never leaves a soldier's ear. Punishments do not always go that far. More common is running the gauntlet. Leather straps and sticks laid across your ribs as you sprint between ranks. There is demotion. There is the barley ration. There is the slow death of being labelled a disgrace. Missio ignominiosa, dishonourable discharge, staples you to a lifetime of side-eye wherever Latin is spoken. The parade ground myth claims Roman combat is clean geometry, testudo, gladius, victory. The lived version is noise and grit. The scutum bows against you as projectiles rattle its face. Pilum shafts hum past your ear. The standard-bearer's weight of the eagle feels like the planet's center of gravity. You throw, you close, you crash. The gladius slides under ribs or into a thigh. The man next to you breathes in your ear. Everyone grunts. The line buckles and flexes. Centurions shout without asking your opinion. Drills teach you to aim at the belly or the groin because it ends fights. Scars don't earn you extra rations. They itch under armor. Certain battles hang in barracks talk like storm clouds. Teutoburg Forest, 9C. 3 whole legions. XVI, the Adeshchen, wiped out under Publius Quinctilius Varus. Tacitus and Velleius Paterculus described the ambush with the grim relish of men who herd survivors. Mud, rain, broken lines, defensive ditches built by panicked soldiers in a forest that hated them. Standards lost to Germanic tribes who treated them as trophies. The Romans eventually recover some eagles. Germanicus brings a couple back in 15 to couple back in 15 to time. 16 sire. But the unit numbers are retired like a shirt you never wear again, because it saw something unspeakable. Care, 53 bess. 7 legions under Crassus gutted by Parthian cavalry, and arrows that turned the desert sun into a glittering wall of pain. Plutarch recoils at the carnage and the delusion. Rome's tactical playbook met horse archers who refused to play. Weapon design does not fix hubris when the other guy controls the horizon. Boudicca's revolt in Britain, 60-61. So, a near-disaster then crushing victory saga, where the legions under Suetonius Paulinus finally hold formation and carve down a mass of tribes after letting impatience and logistics nearly strap them to a pyre. Tacitus writes it with drama because the dead were real. For months, garrisons burned and veterans died with their settlements. The legions that show up late live with that shame. Sieges look glorious carved on marble. They smell like rot in real time. Alasia in 52 bars is the engineering flex everyone cites. Caesar brags in his commentaries about building 2 walls, a double line of fortifications around Vercingetorix, an inner line, a circumvallation to contain the Gauls inside, and an outer line, a contravallation to keep relief armies out. Ditches, stakes, traps, towers, tens of kilometers of earthwork. It is genius. It is also 10 days of mud on your calves while you watch men starve. Masada in 73C ends with Legio Tens Fretenses, using 8 camps and a circumvallation wall and a massive siege ramp to crack the plateau. Josephus counts roughly 8,000 troops and describes the ramp creeping upward like a tooth. The engineering textbooks celebrate the gradient. Your back experiences the gradient as a lifelong complaint. Campaigns in Dacia under Trajan, 101-106, require bridge work of legendary scale. Apollodorus of Damascus throws the Danube a segmental arch bridge. You get to carry timbers, hammer pilings, and sweat under a sun that acts like an angry supervisor. You then climb hills of Orishti and fight men with moon-shaped falx blades that chew through arms and helmets. The Empire adapts with extra arm guards and reinforced helmets You adapt by not being where the falx lands. Those fancy reliefs on Trajan's column in Rome look tidy. You remember the panic of seeing a friend's shield peel apart. The weather never signs your oath, but enforces it. Britain is cold and wet. Germania is damp and busy with mosquitoes. North Africa is dry, but a blister factory. Judea and Syria bounce between scorching days and teeth-chattering nights. The armor rubs raw anywhere it moves. Posca stings when it hits a split lip. A cloak does double duty as blanket and raincoat. Baths exist, mostly at permanent forts and big camps. On campaign, cleaning happens in streams and buckets and in your dreams. Diseases are the real superweapon. Latrines and sanitation in Roman forts actually impress modern archaeologists. The Romans build them with running water where they can and scrape excrement into ditches elsewhere. And they understand, at least on a practical level, that filth makes illness. But viruses and parasites remain undefeated. The Antonine Plague hits around 165. See and rolls through garrisons and towns for years. Cassius Dio and Galen described the horror without modern clarity about what pathogen it was. Smallpox is a strong candidate. Death tolls climb, units shrink, and replacements come in green. Even without pandemics, every camp battles fevers, intestinal infections, and respiratory ailments. Vindelander tablets talk about cold and the need for more socks. The phrasing is almost funny until you picture a foot rotting in a boot. Yes, there is medical care. A legion has medici, medical personnel, and capsari, orderlies with bandages attached to units. Celsus, writing around the 1st century C, leaves instructions on surgery that make modern readers wince and nod. Arrowheads are probed out, wounds are stitched. Tourniquets exist in theory. Opium poppy exists. Wine is antiseptic to a degree that matters. Sometimes a skilled surgeon saves you. Sometimes the field hospital is where sepsis introduces itself by your name. Your legal rights shrink when you sign. For much of the early empire, you cannot legally marry while serving. This is not because no one likes romance. It keeps soldiers from trying to drag families across imperial frontiers. Children you have during service exist in a legal grey zone until discharge. You may call a woman your contubernalis, partner intent, and raise a family unofficially in the Canabi, the civilian settlement unofficially in the Canabi, the civilian settlement outside the fort. But before Septimius Severus around 197 Cs recognizes soldiers' marriages, the state pretends not to hear wedding bells. The discharge document, the diploma, often grants citizen status to your partner and kids with a legal flourish that feels both generous and insulting because it arrives after decades. Barracks life develops its own climate. 8 men in a contubernium are a marriage the law does not regulate. You share tasks, tools, jokes, fleas, and blame. Officers slot you into a century commanded by a centurion with an optio as deputy, and tribunes and legates who mix administrative work with very theatrical speeches. A century is not 100 men, because numbers lie. Figure around 80 men in a standard century, with the first cohort of a legion larger. Double strength, so your legion of 6,000 inches looks more like 5,000 to 5,500 on most rosters, plus attached cavalry and specialists. Drummers and hornblowers bark orders in sound. Standard bearers carry more than flags. They carry more than flags. They carry the unit's pride and a legal identity connected to pay chests and honor. When a standard goes missing, everyone ages 10 years. Prisoners and plunder complicate your conscience only if you have time. Josephus describes tens of thousands enslaved after Jerusalem falls. The markets swell. You carry chains when told. The empire calls it pacification. Your hand calls it friction burn. All this wealth moves through your camp and right past your purse, unless your commander is feeling generous or wants a reputation as generous. Many commanders do. Generosity buys loyalty. The year of the 4 emperors, 69 say, turns that lesson into a blood-soaked classroom. Legions back Galba, then Otho, then Vitellius, then finally Vespasian, and mostly because leadership looks like cash and competence. Battles at Bedriacum near Cremona in northern Italy turn legion against legion. Plunder begins to look cyclical rather than exotic. Rome's greatest killing machine excels at killing Romans. The daily grind keeps going when you are not marching or fighting. Road building hammers away at your joints. Bridges span rivers because your unit drags timber into place. You hew stone for forts and amphitheatres. Legio to Augusta in Britain leaves inscriptions tied to building works. The amphitheatre at Caerleon becomes a legacy of blisters. Hadrian's Wall rises in the 120. Hadrian's Wall rises in the 120s. It is 73 English miles, long give or take, stone and turf in segments, with mile castles and turrets and forts behind. Tourists admire the view. You remember hauling baskets of rubble in the wind and wondering why the boots are designed like windows. The sexuality of the camp is not a fresco. Brothels exist. Wives and children live outside the walls in many places, whether or not law recognizes them. Violence does not take a day off, which is why military law smashes soldiers hard if they cross certain lines with civilians. Garrisons need goodwill to survive winter without riots. A centurion's discipline can keep a village on your side or push it into the arms of rebels. Tacitus and Josephus both sketch how a high-handed commander becomes a magnet for insurgency. Taxes plus arrogance equals torchlight. Mutinies happen when patience snaps. In 14C, after Augustus dies, the legions in Pannonia and Germania explode over pay and length of service. Tacitus writes about the veterans showing scars and complaining of 20 or more years swallowed by the camp. They demand discharge at 16 years and better pay, some shouting for 1 denarius a day, which would triple their nominal stipend if paid in full, without deductions. Tiberius sends Drusus to calm them with speeches and bribes and executions. The ringleaders exit life abruptly. The rest re-enter rank and file, with a raise that arrives in stages. The memory stays prickly. Every new emperor knows the math. Soldiers who feel cheated shop for a new boss. Honor looks shiny from a distance and complicated up close. The corona civica, the civic crown of oak leaves, awarded for saving a citizen's life, hangs in a shrine and on your tongue for the rest of your days. Phalere, those big metal discs, worn as awards, make a breastplate look like a solar panel. Your centurion, if fearsome and fair, can become the man whose nod keeps nightmares off your back. The unit standard carries an almost religious aura. Sacrifices to the standards are not optional. Swear to the emperor, swear to the eagle, and on certain days swear to survive until tomorrow's rations. The ceremonies are earnest because they glue the machine together. The myth that every legionary is a Roman citizen with a Latin name and spore tattooed on his heart blurs out the edges. Auxiliaries do most of the scut work of garrison life and field operations, often fighting just as furiously for a longer term and less pay. They learn Latin in the cold. The pay gap buys citizenship and pride in the end, but the casualty list does not care about legal niceties. By the 2nd century, differences in equipment narrow. Auxiliary cavalry can be superb. Light infantry and archers from the east change how Rome fights. Specialists from everywhere give the legions muscle memory they did not grow at home. Your body becomes the empire's favorite project. You drill with a shield arm that grows thicker than the other. The right shoulder pulls awkwardly from throwing pillar for hours. The hips ache from march posture. Digging trenches teaches your back a Latin vocabulary of pain. The vinegar in your wine chews enamel. Bathing in a stream under winter stars teaches your lungs modern dance. Rations with not enough vitamin C flirt with scurvy in long sieges. Bread, bacon, cheese, repeat, is a diet that gets the job done but does not land a cookery show. Paperwork hunts you, even here. Pay lists, duty rosters, watch schedules, grain tallies, letters home, wax tablets with compliments and complaints. At Vindolanda, the most famous letter is a birthday invitation from Claudia Severa to Sulpicia Lepidina, a commander's wife, written around 100 C with a flourish that looks heartbreakingly human. Another tablet records a request for more socks and sandals. You can almost hear the teeth chattering behind the ink. This is how your life lands in a museum. Laundry, birthdays, and a plea for underwear. Engineering saves lives and ends them. Artillery, ballistae, scorpiones, shoots bolts and stones farther than you can throw. They need crews and maintenance and raw nerve when a torsion spring snaps. Building a ramp for a siege looks like work until the wall above you explodes with rocks and fire. Frontinus, a Roman writer on stratagems, collects clever tricks that sound like party anecdotes for psychopaths. It is inspiring and exhausting to serve in an army that takes notes on everything. The law pretends to be clear about spoils and slaves. In practice, it is bargaining every day. A good commander writes your name in the charity ledger. A bad one writes you off. Augustus creates the Arium Militar, the military treasury, in 6C to stabilize veteran payouts, funding it with a 5% inheritance tax and a 1% sales tax. A normal legionary under Augustus expects 3,000 denarii at discharge after 20 years. The number wobbles over time. Inflation and debasement gnaw at coinage like mice. Septimius Severus pours money at troops in the early 3rd century and turns the financial knob until it snaps. You are paid more absolute coins, and those coins buy less bread. Soldiers can smell debasement, as well as any money changer. Confidence unravels. Pay chests arrive late. Morale follows the rhythm of a mule cart. Debunk the Hollywood parade. Decimation did not happen. Every other Wednesday. It is documented in notorious episodes because it was so extreme. Commanders preferred targeted brutality and paid discipline over massacring their own units. Also debunk the gladius-only myth. Javelins, stones, slings, and arrows kill more efficiently than close-quarters swordplay most days. Rome's heavy infantry builds its reputation on discipline and coordination, not on individual duels. The testudo formation with interlocked shields looks great for cameras. It protects against arrows in sieges and showpieces. In open field melee, fighting like a mobile box is a good way to become compost. You use the right tool for the right moment because your sergeant's bones say so. Debunk the cozy winter myth. Winter quarters, Hiberna, can be grim. Drafts whistle through timber barracks. Fires smoke more than they heat. The cold creeps through every seam. Supply lines are an art form in bad weather. Animals die because they do not care about your schedule. Villages nearby can be friendly until tax season. Once your unit steps on local toes, watch the clearing in the woods. Not everything is misery. Camaraderie attaches itself to you. The contubarium will carry a friend if he breaks on the march, because the alternative is choosing who digs the grave. The centurion whose vitis finds your ribs in training might also be the man who hauls you out of a ditch when your foot catches. Promotions exist. Library quiet posts exist in rich provinces, with good wine and decent roofs. Some veterans retire with cash, pick up land in colonies from Spain to Syria, and become the crust of a new town. The empire spreads that way, as much as it conquers. But those stories share space with names on tombstones that list ages like 23, 27, 31. The equipment alone writes your autobiography in steel and leather. The Pugio dagger at your hip acts as a tool and a backup threat. The belt, baldric, and apron strips clink when you walk, because intimidation sometimes travels by sound. The crest on a centurion's helmet runs laterally because visibility matters. The transverse crest tells the line where its spine lives. The standard for your century shows hands painted on, or boars or gods, and you can spot it in a storm. And Aquila, your legion's eagle, stands more precious than any chest of coin. Lose it, and you feel the empire stare at you through all its temples. Symbols line up with reality when luck shows up. Germanicus's recovery of lost standards after Teutoburg is a joy note in a minor key decade. Titus's triumph with the spoils of Jerusalem is a morale victory stamped in marble on the Arch of Titus. Trajan's Dacian spoils taste lovely in Rome's markets and build fancy public works that remind everyone why they tolerate taxes. But the shine at the top does not polish your tent. You and 7 men go to sleep in a patch of dirt that smells like iron. No senator tucks in your feet. The days blur until the oddness stands out. The days your unit builds a bridge of boats. The days a priest inspects a pig's liver and declares it favorable. The days your cohort lines up to receive a crown for storming a wall, while your hands still shake from climbing it. The days the general gives a speech that actually means something. The days a provincial family waves at you like you are more promise than threat. The days your male coif sticks to a wound and every breath is loud. The days you find an inscription carved by a soldier 20 years before wishing good luck to the next poor soul. The army makes memories by grinding them into you. Your relationship with the emperor is like being a shareholder in a company you cannot leave. The sacramentum binds you to the man on the purple throne. He feeds you, pays you, and kills you if you do not clap hard enough. Some emperors understand the contract. Augustus wraps discipline in generosity and spectacle and the promise of a pension. Vespasian steadies the ship after civil war with a businessman's calm. Trajan wins wars and writes letters to governors asking practical questions. Like a manager you weirdly trust, others abuse the bargain. Caligula drags legions to the Channel and orders them to collect seashells as spoils. Nero plays music while provinces burn and then instructs you to believe in his innocence. The army becomes kingmaker and kingbreaker. The oath starts to sound like a price tag. Somewhere between watch rotations and ditch digging, you learn how the empire actually runs. Roads do not just exist for merchants. They exist for you. Aqueducts keep the baths flowing, but they also keep camps clean. Forts anchor the tax system by projecting presence. Bridges shorten distances in a way that maps understate. Garrisons bend local economies around themselves, feeding and clothing thousands of mouths, and in return the locals watch your moods the way sailors watch skies. Your boots inscribe Rome on landscapes that never sent an invitation. Now circle back to the cozy myth of an unstoppable, perfectly organized super army. The reality is better because it is credible. Supplies run out, commanders fumble, rivers flood, enemies innovate, weather laughs at your schedule, coinage loses silver content, soldiers talk, mutinies flare, friendly fire kills, garrison boredom erupts into bar brawls that dent reputations. And still, the structure holds enough to annex provinces from Britain to Mesopotamia and keep them long enough for Latin to show up on gravestones generations later. The magic is not that you are a machine. The magic is that you are human under pressure, and the system harnesses that for centuries. You are not a gladiator. You are not a knight. You are a professional in an institution that will outlive you in paperwork and gravel. The vine staff always waits. The pay chest trundles and squeaks. The standard gleams as much as the grease allows. The oath does not forget you exist. Recruiting slogans and marble inscriptions make the gig look like a divine appointment. The truth sits closer. You carry a short sword, a heavy shield, and a tent that smells like wet dog. You live on grain, bacon, and vinegar. You build a fort every evening, just in case. You stand in line and become part of a war, more reliable than any city's defenses. You feel fear and step forward because the man beside you is stepping forward. Inscriptions on tombstones capture the summary in chipped Latin. Name, unit, origin, age, years served. The rock is honest. The rock does not embellish. This does not mean the life is empty. It is heavy with meaning that tastes metallic. A soldier's diploma, after discharge, confers citizenship on a wife and children you always counted as family. A patch of land in a colony on the edge of nowhere becomes a farm with your name on it. A boy in a town sees you march past and chooses your path because the alternative looks like being invisible. The empire expands because men in boots make straight lines out of chaos. The cost sits in your knees and on stones that mark how long you lasted. The myths about clean strategy and endless money and the invincible gladius draw clicks. The facts draw respect. Polybius and Caesar bragged about training because training is the difference between a parade and a funeral. Tacitus described mutinies because even Rome's iron discipline bent under bad math. Josephus lingered over siege machines because mobs with courage alone shatter against logs and ropes. Suetonius tallied pay raises because soldiers count coin better than senators. Thinderlander's tablets whisper about socks because cold is political in a wooden barracks. Celsus wrote about surgery because everyone needed to know how to pull an arrowhead cleanly. Res Gestae inscribed Augustus's donations because legitimacy equals cash plus stability. Cassius Dio complained about Severus's pay raises eroding discipline because he watched the coin lose its mind. These writers argue with each other, boast, mourn, and fudge, but together they paint your life in harsh, exact brushstrokes. A legionary, in an empire that worships order, spends most of his time managing chaos. Mud, hunger, jealousy, delays, screams, prayers, and bureaucracy all march in your column. The empire romanticizes you to the public and frightens you in private. It trusts you with roads, aqueducts, gates, and borders, and too often with emperor's ambitions that have more color than wisdom. When it works, the system plants Latin in a place that never heard it, raises a stone that outlasts winters, and teaches generations how to stand shoulder to shoulder when running looks rational. When it fails, forests like Teutoburg grow thick over bones and legion numbers vanish from the rolls. as if embarrassed. You wake up before dawn because the watch changes and the camp needs to move. The vinegar goes down. The pack goes up. The centurion counts without looking like he is counting. The Optio's staff taps a slow metronome on a shin. If someone fidgets, standards tilt as the horn sounds. You step off with 1,000 small aches and one massive purpose. You will dig a ditch tonight, whether or not you fight at noon. You will bake bread you ground yourself. You will curse a stone in your sandal. You will laugh at something stupid, because humor is a better physic than frankincense. You will pray in Latin, Greek, Celtic, Punic, or a quiet grunt to any god that listens. You will learn new swear words in the local language faster than trade terms. You will spot an ambush too late and respond just fast enough. You will buy a little jar of scented oil because the vendor promises it keeps lice away, and you will suspect he is lying. You will guard a cart full of coins that cannot buy a summer dry enough to close the cracks in your hands. You finally reach the point they call veteranus. Your back tells you before the scroll does. The discharge bonus rattles into your hands as denarii that smell like sweaty leather and unrealistic promises. You board a ship to a new colony, or tramp back to your village, or linger near the fort that became home because the cannabis there holds more of your life than the place you started. A bronze diploma is nailed on a wall, declaring you a Roman citizen if you were not one before, declaring your family legal, declaring your time measured and complete. A land grant appears, on paper at least. Taxes find you wherever you go. Muscle memory drills your steps across fields like a centurion's ghost, lives in your garden. Glory lingers as a story you tell. Younger men over a cheap cup of wine. The story contains certain numbers you will not forget, because the body remembers what the brain misplaces. 20 miles. In 5 hours in armor, that bit. 50 measures of grain for the cohort, because the quartermaster snored. 10 tents mended on a wet day, because stitching leather beats thinking. 4 friendly faces, gone before they learned what promotion felt like. 2 standards, recovered at a cost that emptied a century. 1 oath said once, and then renewed silently, every morning for years, because the Empire respects ritual and punishes sarcasm. No one inscribes the smell of wet wool on marble. No one carves the taste of Posca next to an emperor's victories. The record prefers numbers and names. The senses belong to you. This is why the sleek myths wobble and the gritty facts stand up. Being a Roman legionary often sucked, imprecise, countable, daily ways. It also made the world you walked through unbelievably ordered compared to what came before, and that order ate pieces of you to sustain itself. The road under your feet bears the stamp of a legion's mark, a unit's number, and a handful of curses muttered the day it was laid. Every tourist on every Roman ruin walks on your blisters. 2,000 years later, the systems you endured still fascinate for their ruthless efficiency. That efficiency rests on bodies like yours, carrying 30 to 45 kilograms on a good day, absorbing stress fractures and centurions' rants, trusting a pay chest that might be light and a commander who might be vain, learning to turn fear into formation, holding a shield like it is a wall, and marching farther than a sane person hikes for free. The Empire did not build itself by magic. It built itself on your shoulders, and those shoulders hurt.